Mice in space. Elon Musk turned 30 in June 2001, and the birthday hit him hard. "I'm no longer a child. Prodigy," he told Justine, only half joking. That same month X.com officially changed its name to PayPal, providing a harsh reminder that the company had been ripped away from Musk and given to someone else to run. The startup life, which Musk described as akin to eating glass and staring into the abyss, had gotten old, and so had Silicon Valley. It felt like Musk was living inside a trade show where everyone worked in the technology industry and talked all the time about funding, IPOs, and chasing big paydays. People liked to brag about the crazy hours they worked, and Justine would just laugh, knowing Musk had lived a more extreme version of the Silicon Valley lifestyle than they could imagine. "I had friends who complained that their husbands came home at 7 or 8, she said. Elon would come home at 11 and work some more. People didn't always get the sacrifice he made in order to be where he was. The idea of escaping this incredibly lucrative rat race started to grow more and more appealing. Musk's entire life had been about chasing a bigger stage, and Palo Alto seemed more like a stepping stone than a final destination. The couple decided to move south and begin their family in the next chapter of their lives in Los Angeles. "There's an element to him that likes the style and the excitement and color of a place like LA," said Justine. "Elon likes to be where the action is." A small group of Musk's friends who felt similarly had also decamped to Los Angeles for what would be a wild couple of years. It wasn't just Los Angeles's glitz and grandeur that attracted Musk. It was also the call of space. After being pushed out of PayPal, Musk had started to revisit his childhood fantasies around rocket ships and space travel, and to think that he might have a greater calling than creating internet services. The changes in his attitude and thinking soon became obvious to his friends, including a group of PayPal executives who had gathered in Las Vegas one weekend to celebrate the company's success. "We're all hanging out in this cabana at the Hard Rock Cafe, and Elon is there reading some obscure Soviet rocket manual that was all moldy and looked like it had been bought on eBay," said Kevin Hartz, an early PayPal investor. He was studying it and talking openly about space travel and changing the world. Musk had picked Los Angeles with intent. It gave him access to space, or at least the space industry. Southern California's mild, consistent weather had made it a favored city of the aeronautics industry since the 1920s, when the Lockheed Aircraft Company set up shop in Hollywood. Howard Hughes, the U.S. Air Force, NASA, Boeing, and myriad other people and organizations have performed much of their manufacturing and cutting-edge experimentation in and around Los Angeles. Today the city remains a major hub for the military's aeronautics work and commercial activity. While Musk didn't know exactly what he wanted to do in space, he realized that just by being in Los Angeles he would be surrounded by the world's top aeronautics thinkers. They could help him refine any ideas, and there would be plenty of recruits to join his next venture. Musk's first interactions with the aeronautics community were with an eclectic collection of space enthusiasts, members of a non-profit group called the Mars Society, dedicated to exploring and settling the Red Planet. The Mars Society planned to hold a fundraiser in mid-2001. The $500 per plate event was to take place at the house of one of the well-off Mars Society members, and invitations to the usual characters had been mailed out. What stunned Robert Zubrin, the head of the group, was the reply from someone named Elon Musk, whom no one could remember inviting. "He gave us a check for $5,000, Zubrin said. That made everyone take notice. Zubrin began researching Musk, determined he was rich, and invited him for coffee ahead of the dinner. "I wanted to make sure he knew the projects we had underway," Zubrin said. He proceeded to regale Musk with tales of the research center the society had built in the Arctic to mimic the tough conditions of Mars and the experiments they had been running for something called the Translife mission, in which there would be a spinning capsule orbiting Earth that was piloted by a crew of mice. It would spin to give them 1/3 gravity, the same you would have on Mars, and they would live there and reproduce, Zubrin told Musk. When it was time for dinner, Zubrin placed Musk at the VIP table next to himself, the director in space buff James Cameron, and Carol Stoker, a planetary scientist for NASA with a deep interest in Mars. Elon is so youthful looking and at that time he looked like a little boy, Stoker said. Cameron was chatting him up right away to invest in his next movie, and Zubran was trying to get him to make a big donation to the Mars Society. In return for being hounded for cash, Musk probed about for ideas and contacts. Stoker's husband was an aerospace engineer at NASA working on a concept for an airplane that would glide over Mars looking for water. Musk loved that. He was much more intense than some of the other millionaires, Zubran said. He didn't know a lot about space, but he had a scientific mind. He wanted to know exactly what was being planned in regards to Mars and what the significance would be. Musk took to the Mars Society right away and joined its board of directors. He donated another $100,000 to fund a research station in the desert as well. Musk's friends were not entirely sure what to make of his mental state. He'd lost a tremendous amount of weight fighting off malaria and looked almost skeletal. With little prompting, Musk would start expounding on his desire to do something meaningful with his life, something lasting. His next move had to be either in solar or in space. He said, "The logical thing to happen next is solar, but I can't figure out how to make any money out of it," said George Zachary, the investor and close friend of Musk's, recalling a lunch date at the time. Then he started talking about space, and I thought he meant office space. Like a real estate play. Musk had actually started thinking bigger than the Mars Society. Rather than send a few mice into Earth's orbit, Musk wanted to send them to Mars. Some very rough calculations done at the time suggested that the journey would cost $15 million. He asked if I thought that was crazy, Zachary said. I asked, do the mice come back? Because, if they don't, yeah, most people will think that's crazy. As it turned out, the mice were not only meant to go to Mars and come back but were also meant to procreate along the way, during a journey that would take months. Jeff Skoll, another one of Musk's friends who made a fortune at eBay, pointed out that the fornicating mice would need a hell of a lot of cheese and bought Musk a giant wheel of Le Gruyere, a type of Gruyere. Musk did not mind becoming the butt of cheese jokes. The more he thought about space, the more important its exploration seemed to him. He felt as if the public had lost some of its ambition and hope for the future. The average person might see space exploration as a waste of time and effort and rib him for talking about the subject, but Musk thought about interplanetary travel in a very earnest way. He wanted to inspire the masses and reinvigorate their passion for science, conquest, and the promise of technology. His fears that mankind had lost much of its will to push the boundaries were reinforced one day when Musk went to the NASA website. He'd expected to find a detailed plan for exploring Mars and instead found bookers. At first I thought, geez, maybe I'm just looking in the wrong place, Musk once told Wired. Why was there no plan, no schedule? There was nothing. It seemed crazy. Musk believed that the very idea of America was intertwined with humanity's desire to explore. He found it sad that the American agency tasked with doing audacious things in space and exploring new frontiers as its mission seemed to have no serious interest in investigating Mars at all. The spirit of manifest destiny had been deflated or maybe even come to a depressing end, and hardly anyone seemed to care. Like so many quests to revitalize America's soul and bring hope to all of mankind, Musk's journey began in a hotel conference room. By this time, Musk had built up a decent network of contacts in the space industry, and he brought the best of them together at a series of salons, sometimes at the Renaissance Hotel at the Los Angeles airport and sometimes at the Sheraton Hotel in Palo Alto. Musk had no formal business plan for these people to debate. He mostly wanted them to help him develop the mice to Mars idea or at least to come up with something comparable. Musk hoped to hit on a grand gesture for mankind, some type of event that would capture the world's attention, get people thinking about Mars again, and have them reflect on man's potential. The scientists and luminaries at the meetings were to figure out a spectacle that would be technically feasible at a price tag of approximately $20 million. Musk resigned from his position as a director of the Mars Society and announced his own organization, the Life to Mars Foundation. The collection of talent attending these sessions in 2001 was impressive. Scientists showed up from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL, James Cameron appeared, lending some celebrity to the affair. Also attending was Michael Griffin, whose academic credentials were spectacular and included degrees in aerospace engineering, electrical engineering, civil engineering, and applied physics. Griffin had worked for the CIA's venture capital arm called In-Q-Tel, at NASA, and at JPL, and was just in the process of leaving Orbital Sciences Corporation, a maker of satellites and spacecraft, where he had been Chief Technical Officer and the General Manager of the Space Systems Group. It could be argued that no one on the planet knew more about the realities of getting things into space than Griffin, and he was working for Musk as Space Thinker-in-Chief. 4 years later, in 2005, Griffin took over as head of NASA. The experts were thrilled to have another rich guy appear who was willing to fund something interesting in space. They happily debated the merits and feasibility of sending up rodents and watching them hump. But, as the discussion wore on, a consensus started to build around pursuing a different project, something called Mars Oasis. Under this plan, Musk would buy a rocket and use it to shoot what amounted to a robotic greenhouse to Mars. A group of researchers had already been working on a space-ready growth chamber for plants. The idea was to modify their structure so that it could open up briefly and suck in some of the Martian regolith, or soil, and then use it to grow a plant, which would in turn produce the first oxygen on Mars. Much to Musk's liking, this new plan seemed both ostentatious and feasible. Musk wanted the structure to have a window and a way to send a video feedback to Earth, so that people could watch the plant grow. The group also talked about sending out kits to students around the country who would grow their own plants simultaneously and take notice, for example, that the Martian plant could grow twice as high as its earthbound counterpart in the same amount of time. This concept had been floating around in various forms for a while, said Dave Bearden, a space industry veteran who attended the meetings. It would be, yes, there is life on Mars, and we put it there. The hope was that it might turn on a light for thousands of kids that this place is not that hostile. Then they might start thinking, maybe we should go there. Musk's enthusiasm for the idea started to inspire the group, many of whom had grown cynical about anything novel happening in space again. He's a very smart, very driven guy with a huge ego, Bearden said. At one point someone mentioned that he might become Time magazine's Man of the Year, and you could see him light up. He has this belief that he is the guy who can change the world. The main thing troubling the space experts was Musk's budget. Following the salons, it seemed like Musk wanted to spend somewhere between $20 million and $30 million on the stunt, and everyone knew that the cost of a rocket launch alone would eat up that money and then some. In my mind, you needed $200 million to do it right, Bearden said. But people were reluctant to bring too much reality into the situation too early and just get the whole idea killed. Then there were the immense engineering challenges that would need solving. To have a big window on this thing was a real thermal problem, Bearden said. You could not keep the container warm enough to keep anything alive. Scooping Martian soil into the structure seemed not only hard to do physically but also like a flat-out bad idea since the regolith would be toxic. For a while, the scientists debated growing the plant in a nutrient-rich gel instead, but that felt like cheating and like it might undermine the whole point of the endeavor. Even the optimistic moments were awash in unknowns. One scientist found some very resilient mustard seeds and thought they could possibly survive a treated version of the Martian soil. There was a pretty big downside if the plant didn't survive, Bearden said. You have this dead garden on Mars that ends up giving off the opposite of the intended effect. Asterisk. Musk never flinched. He turned some of the volunteer thinkers into consultants, and put them to work on the plant machine's design. He also plotted a trip to Russia to find out exactly how much a launch would cost. Musk intended to buy a refurbished intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, from the Russians and use that as his launch vehicle. For help with this, Musk reached out to Jim Cantrell, an unusual fellow who had done a mix of classified and unclassified work for the United States and other governments. Among other claims to fame, Cantrell had been accused of espionage and placed under house arrest in 1996 by the Russians after a satellite deal went awry. After a couple of weeks, Al Gore made some calls, and it got worked out, Cantrell said. I didn't want anything to do with the Russians again, ever. Musk had other ideas. Cantrell was driving his convertible on a hot July evening in Utah when a call came in. This guy in a funny accent said, I really need to talk to you. I am a billionaire. I am going to start a space program. Cantrell could not hear Musk well. He thought his name was Elon Musk, and said he would call back. Once he got home, the two men didn't exactly trust each other at the outset. Musk refused to give Cantrell his cell phone number and made the call from his fax machine. Cantrell found Musk both intriguing and all too eager. He asked if there was an airport near me and if I could meet the next day. Cantrell said, my red flags started going off, fearing one of his enemies was trying to orchestrate an elaborate setup. Cantrell told Musk to meet him at the Salt Lake City airport, where he would rent a conference room near the Delta Lounge. I wanted him to meet me behind security so he couldn't pack a gun, Cantrell said. When the meeting finally took place, Musk and Cantrell hit it off. Musk rolled out his "humans need to become a multiplanetary species" speech, and Cantrell said that if Musk was really serious, he'd be willing to go to Russia again and help buy a rocket. In late October 2001, Musk, Cantrell, and Adeo Ressi, Musk's friend from college, boarded a commercial flight to Moscow. Ressi had been playing the role of Musk's guardian and trying to ascertain whether his best friend had started to lose his mind. Compilation videos of rockets exploding were made, and interventions were held with Musk's friends trying to talk him out of wasting his money. While these measures failed, Adeo went along to Russia to try to contain Musk as best as he could. Adeo would call May to the side and say, what Elon is doing is insane. A philanthropic gesture. That's crazy, Cantrell said. He was seriously worried but was down with the trip. And why not? The men were heading to Russia at the height of its freewheeling post-Soviet days when rich guys could apparently buy space missiles on the open market. Team Musk would grow to include Mike Griffin, and meet with the Russians 3 times over a period of 4 months. The group set up a few meetings with companies like NPO Lavikin, which had made probes intended for Mars and Venus for the Russian Federal Space Agency, and Cosmotras, a commercial rocket launcher. The appointments all seemed to go the same way, following Russian decorum. The Russians, who often skipped breakfast, would ask to meet around 11 a.m. at their offices for an early lunch. Then there would be small talk for an hour or more as the meeting attendees picked over a spread of sandwiches, sausages, and, of course, vodka. At some point during this process, Griffin usually started to lose his patience. He suffers fools very poorly, Cantrell said. He's looking around and wondering when we are going to get down to fucking business. The answer was not soon. After lunch came a lengthy smoking and coffee drinking period. Once all of the tables were cleared, the Russian in charge would turn to Musk and ask, what is it you are interested in buying? The big windup may not have bothered Musk as much if the Russians had taken him more seriously. They looked at us like we were not credible people, Cantrell said. One of their chief designers spat on me and Elon because he thought we were full of shit. The most intense meeting occurred in an ornate, neglected, pre-revolutionary building near downtown Moscow. The vodka shots started to space, to America, while Musk sat on $20 million, which he hoped would be enough to buy 3 ICBMs that could be retooled to go to space. Buzzed from the vodka, Musk asked point blank how much a missile would cost. The reply, $8 million each. Musk counted, offering $8 million for 2. They sat there and looked at him, Cantrell said. And said something like, young boy. No. They also intimated that he didn't have the money. At this point, Musk had decided the Russians were either not serious about doing business or determined to part a millionaire from as much of his money as possible. He stormed out of the meeting. The Team Musk mood could not have been worse. It was near the end of February 2002, and they went outside to hail a cab and drove straight to the airport surrounded by the snow and dreck of the Moscow winter. Inside the cab, no one talked. Musk had come to Russia filled with optimism about putting on a great show for mankind and was now leaving exasperated and disappointed by human nature. The Russians were the only ones with rockets that could possibly fit within Musk's budget. It was a long drive, Cantrell said. We sat there in silence looking at the Russian peasants shopping in the snow. The somber mood lingered all the way to the plane, until the drink cart arrived. You always feel particularly good when the wheels lift off in Moscow, Cantrell said. It's like, my God, I made it. So, Griffin and I got drinks and clinked our glasses. Musk sat in the row in front of them, typing on his computer. We're thinking, fucking nerd, what can he be doing now? At which point Musk wheeled around and flashed a spreadsheet he'd created. Hey, guys, he said, I think we can build this rocket ourselves. Griffin and Cantrell had downed a couple of drinks by this time and were too deflated to entertain a fantasy. They knew all too well the stories of gung-ho millionaires who thought they could conquer space, only to lose their fortunes. Just the year before, Andrew Beale, a real estate and finance whiz in Texas, folded his aerospace company after having poured millions into a massive test site. We're thinking, yeah, you and whose fucking army, Cantrell said. But, Elon says, no, I'm serious. I have this spreadsheet. Musk passed his laptop over to Griffin and Cantrell, and they were dumbfounded. The document detailed the costs of the materials needed to build, assemble, and launch a rocket. According to Musk's calculations, he could undercut existing launch companies by building a modest-sized rocket that would cater to a part of the market that specialized in carrying smaller satellites and research payloads to space. The spreadsheet also laid out the hypothetical performance characteristics of the rocket in fairly impressive detail. I said, Elon, where did you get this? Cantrell said. Musk had spent months studying the aerospace industry and the physics behind it. From Cantrell and others, he'd borrowed rocket propulsion elements, fundamentals of astrodynamics, and aerodynamics of gas turbine and rocket propulsion, along with several more seminal texts. Musk had reverted to his childhood state as a devourer of information and had emerged from this meditative process with the realization that rockets could and should be made much cheaper than what the Russians were offering. Forget the mice. Forget the plant with its own video feed growing, or possibly dying, en masse. Musk would inspire people to think about exploring space again by making it cheaper to explore space. As word traveled around the space community about Musk's plans, there was a collective ho-hum. People like Zubrin had seen this show many times before. There was a string of zillionaires that got sold. A good story by an engineer, Zubrin said. Combine my brains and your money, and we can build a rocket ship that will be profitable and open up the space frontier. The techies usually ended up spending the rich guy's money for 2 years, and then the rich guy gets bored and shuts the thing down. With Elon, everyone gave a sigh and said, oh well, he could have spent $10 million to send up the mice, but instead he'll spend hundreds of millions and probably fail like all the others that preceded him. While well aware of the risks tied to starting a rocket company, Musk had at least one reason to think he might succeed where others had failed. That reason's name was Tom Mueller. Mueller grew up the son of a logger in the tidy Idaho town of St. Mary's, where he developed a reputation as an oddball. While the rest of the kids were outside exploring the woods in winter, Mueller stayed warm in the library, reading books or watching Star Trek at his house. He also tinkered. Walking to grade school one day, Mueller discovered a smashed clock in an alley and turned it into a pet project. Each day, he fixed some part of the clock, a gear, a spring, until he got it working. A similar thing happened with the family's lawnmower, which Mueller disassembled one afternoon on the front lawn for fun. My dad came home and was so mad because he thought he'd have to buy a new mower, Mueller said. But I put it back together, and it ran. Mueller then got stuck on rockets. He started buying mail order kits and following the instructions to build small rockets. Rather quickly, Mueller graduated to constructing his own devices. At the age of 12, he crafted a mock-up space shuttle that could be attached to a rocket, sent up into the air, and then glide back to the ground. For a science project a couple of years later, Mueller borrowed his dad's oxyacetylene welding equipment to make a rocket engine prototype. Mueller cooled the device by placing it upside down in a coffee can full of water. I could run it like that all day long, and invented equally creative ways to measure its performance. The machine was good enough for Mueller to win a couple of regional science fair competitions and end up at an international event. That's where I promptly got my ass kicked, Mueller said. Tall, lanky, and with a rectangular face, Mueller is an easygoing sort who muddled through college for a bit, teaching his friends how to make smoke bombs, and then eventually settled down and did well as a mechanical engineering student. Fresh out of college, he worked for Hughes Aircraft on satellites. It wasn't rockets, but it was close, and then went to TRW Space and Electronics. It was the latter half of the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program had the space gearheads dreaming about kinetic weapons and all sorts of mayhem. At TRW, Mueller experimented with crazy types of propellants and oversaw the development of the company's TR-106 engine, a giant machine fueled by liquid oxygen and hydrogen. As a hobby, Mueller hung out with a couple hundred amateur rocketry buffs in the Reaction Research Society, a group formed in 1943 to encourage the building and firing of rockets. On weekends, Mueller traveled out to the Mojave Desert with the other RRS members to push the limits of amateur machines. Mueller was one of the club's standouts, able to build things that actually worked, and could experiment with some of the more radical concepts that were quashed by his conservative bosses at TRW. His crowning achievement was an 80-pound engine that could produce 13,000 pounds of thrust and earned accolades as the world's largest liquid-fuel rocket engine built by an amateur. I still keep the rockets hanging in my garage, Mueller said. In January 2002, Mueller was hanging out in the workshop of John Garvey, who had left a job at the aerospace company McDonnell Douglas to start building his own rockets. Garvey's facility was in Huntington Beach, where he rented an industrial space about the size of a 6-car garage. The two men were fiddling around with the 80-pound engine when Garvey mentioned that a guy named Elon Musk might be stopping by. The amateur rocketry scene is tight, and it was Cantrell who recommended that Musk check out Garvey's workshop and see Mueller's designs. On a Sunday, Musk arrived with a pregnant Justine, wearing a stylish black leather trench coat and looking like a high-paid assassin. Mueller had the 80-pound engine on his shoulder and was trying to bolt it to a support structure when Musk began peppering him with questions. He asked me how much thrust it had, Mueller said. He wanted to know if I had ever worked on anything bigger. I told him that yeah, I'd worked on a 650,000-pound thrust engine at TRW and knew every part of it. Mueller set the engine down and tried to keep up with Musk's interrogation. How much would that big engine cost? Musk asked. Mueller told him TRW built it for about $12 million. Musk shot back, yeah, but how much could you really do it for? Mueller ended up chatting with Musk for hours. The next weekend, Mueller invited Musk to his house to continue their discussion. Musk knew he had found someone who really knew the ins and outs of making rockets. After that, Musk introduced Mueller to the rest of his roundtable of space experts in their stealthy meetings. The caliber of the people impressed Mueller, who had turned down past job offers from Beale and other budding space magnates because of their borderline insane ideas. Musk, by contrast, seemed to know what he was doing, weeding out the naysayers meeting by meeting and forming a crew of bright, committed engineers. Mueller had helped Musk fill out that spreadsheet around the performance and cost metrics of a new low-cost rocket, and, along with the rest of Team Musk, had subsequently refined the idea. The rocket would not carry truck-sized satellites like some of the monster rockets flown by Boeing, Lockheed, the Russians, and others countries. Instead, Musk's rocket would be aimed at the lower end of the satellite market, and it could end up as ideal for an emerging class of smaller payloads that capitalized on the massive advances that had taken place in recent years in computing and electronics technology. The rocket would cater directly to a theory in the space industry that a whole new market might open for both commercial and research payloads if a company could drastically lower the price per launch and perform launches on a regular schedule. Musk relished the idea of being at the forefront of this trend and developing the workhorse of a new era in space. Of course, all of this was theoretical, and then, suddenly, it wasn't. PayPal had gone public in February with its shares shooting up 55%, and Musk knew that eBay wanted to buy the company as well. While noodling on the rocket idea, Musk's net worth had increased from tens of millions to hundreds of millions. In April 2002, Musk fully abandoned the publicity stunt idea and committed to building a commercial space venture. He pulled aside Cantrell, Griffin, Mueller, and Chris Thompson, an aerospace engineer at Boeing, and told the group, "I want to do this company. If you guys are in, let's do it." Griffin wanted to join but ended up declining when Musk rebuffed his request to live on the East Coast, and Cantrell only stuck around for a few months after this meeting, seeing the venture as too risky. Founded in June 2002, Space Exploration Technologies came to life in humble settings. Musk acquired an old warehouse at 1310 East Grand Avenue in El Segundo, a suburb of Los Angeles humming with the activity of the aerospace industry. The previous tenant of the 75,000 square foot building had done lots of shipping and had used the south side of the facility as a logistics depot, outfitting it with several receiving bays for delivery trucks. This allowed Musk to drive his silver McLaren right into the building. Beyond that, the surroundings were sparse, just a dusty floor and a 40-foot high ceiling with its wooden beams and insulation exposed and which curved at the top to give the place a hangar-like feel. The north side of the building was an office space with cubicles and room for about 50 people. During the first week of SpaceX's operations, delivery trucks showed up packed full of Dell laptops and printers and folding tables that would serve as the first desks. Musk walked over to one of the loading docks, rolled up the door, and offloaded the equipment himself. Musk had soon transformed the SpaceX office with what has become his signature factory aesthetic, a glossy epoxy coating applied over concrete on the floors, and a fresh coat of white paint slathered onto the walls. The white color scheme was intended to make the factory look clean and feel cheerful. Desks were interspersed around the factory so that Ivy League computer scientists and engineers designing the machines could sit with the welders and machinists building the hardware. This approach stood as SpaceX's first major break with traditional aerospace companies that prefer to cordon different engineering groups off from each other and typically separate engineers and machinists by thousands of miles by placing their factories in locations where real estate and labor run cheap. As the first dozen or so employees came to the offices, they were told that SpaceX's mission would be to emerge as the Southwest Airlines of space. SpaceX would build its own engines and then contract with suppliers for the other components of the rocket. The company would gain an edge over the competition by building a better, cheaper engine and by fine-tuning the assembly process to make rockets faster and cheaper than anyone else. This vision included the construction of a type of mobile launch vehicle that could travel to various sites, take the rocket from a horizontal to vertical position, and send it off to space. No muss, no fuss. SpaceX was meant to get so good at this process that it could do multiple launches a month, make money off each one, and never need to become a huge contractor dependent on government funds. SpaceX was to be America's attempt at a clean slate in the rocket business, a modernized reset. Musk felt that the space industry had not really evolved in about 50 years. The aerospace companies had little competition and tended to make supremely expensive products that achieved maximum performance. They were building a Ferrari for every launch, when it was possible that a Honda Accord might do the trick. Musk, by contrast, would apply some of the startup techniques he'd learned in Silicon Valley to run SpaceX lean and fast and capitalize on the huge advances in computing power and materials that had taken place over the past couple of decades. As a private company, SpaceX would also avoid the waste and cost overruns associated with government contractors. Musk declared that SpaceX's first rocket would be called the Falcon 1, a nod to Star Wars Millennium Falcon and his role as the architect of an exciting future. At a time when the cost of sending a 550-pound payload started at $30 million, he promised that the Falcon 1 would be able to carry a 1,400-pound payload for $6.9 million. Bowing to his nature, Musk set an insanely ambitious timeline for all of this. One of the earliest SpaceX presentations suggested that the company would complete its first engine in May 2003, a second engine in June, the body of the rocket in July, and have everything assembled in August. A launch pad would then be prepared by September, and the first launch would take place in November 2003, or about 15 months after the company started. A trip to Mars was naturally slated for somewhere near the end of the decade. This was Musk, the logical, naive optimist, tabulating how long it should take people physically to perform all of this work. It's the baseline he expects of himself, and one that his employees, with their human foibles, are in a never-ending struggle to match.